On the 24th of February, 1779, in the street outside a British fort on the Wabash River, an American commander had 4 captured warriors dragged into full view of the walls, forced to kneel in a circle, and tomahawked to death, one by one, while the enemy garrison watched from the ramparts. Then the bodies were scalped and thrown into the river. He did it deliberately and in cold blood as a message. He wanted the men inside that fort to understand exactly what kind of person had appeared out of the winter to besiege them. A man who had just marched a tiny army through 200 miles of flooded wilderness to reach them, who would not be stopped and who would not show mercy. Within hours, the British commander surrendered. His name was George Rogers Clark, and by that act and others, he conquered a territory larger than many kingdoms, a vast frontier empire in the American West, with almost no men, no money, and no help from anyone. He is one of the great conquerors in American history. He is also one of its most ruthless. Welcome to our video on George Rogers Clark. To understand what drove George Rogers Clark to such extremes, you have to understand the war he was fighting, because it was nothing like the War of Bunker Hill and Yorktown that most people picture. While the great armies clashed along the Atlantic coast, another war raged far to the west, in the wild country beyond the Appalachian Mountains, the Ohio Valley, and the Illinois country, an enormous frontier of forests, rivers, and scattered settlements. This was the west of Kentucky's first pioneers, of isolated cabins and stockaded stations, of settlers who had pushed past the mountains onto land the native nations regarded as their own. And it was a war of a peculiar and terrible savagery. The British held the region through a network of forts, and their strategy was to arm and encourage their native allies to raid the American frontier settlements, to burn the cabins, destroy the crops, and drive the settlers back over the mountains. The nerve center of this effort was the British post at Detroit, and its commander was a British officer named Henry Hamilton. To the Kentuckians, Hamilton was the most hated man on the continent. They called him the hair buyer, because they believed he paid bounties to his allies for the scalps and prisoners they brought back from the American settlements. Whether he paid specifically for scalps is debated by historians, but the reputation was ferocious and real, and the raids were real, and they were killing frontier families, men, women, and children. By the score. This was the war George Rogers Clark grew up into. It was not a war of gentlemanly maneuver and honors of surrender. It was a brutal, close, personal struggle for survival on a wild frontier where atrocity answered atrocity and mercy was in short supply on every side. It bred a particular kind of hard man. And it produced in Clark one of the most audacious and ruthless commanders the Revolution ever saw. But first, this young Virginian had to convince anyone to let him fight it his way. George Rogers Clark was born in Virginia in 1752, which made him, throughout the events that follow, an astonishingly young man for what he accomplished. He came from a large and capable family. A much younger brother, William, would one day become famous as half of the Lewis and Clark expedition. But in the 1770s, the family's remarkable son was George, and he had gone west. Trained as a surveyor, Clark was drawn to the Kentucky frontier as a young man, and he threw himself into its affairs with an energy and ambition that marked him early. He surveyed land, he fought in frontier skirmishes, and he became a leader among the scattered, vulnerable Kentucky settlers who were bearing the brunt of the British-backed raids. He was tall, red-haired, forceful, and possessed of a natural command that made men follow him, and a strategic vision far larger than his years or his rank. Because while others saw only the immediate problem, defend the cabins, survive the next raid, Clark saw the whole board. He understood that the raids on Kentucky did not begin in the native villages. They began in the British forts of the Illinois country and, ultimately, at Detroit. Defending Kentucky settlement by settlement was hopeless. The only way to stop the raids was to strike at their source, to march west and seize the British posts themselves, cutting off the support that made the frontier war possible. It was a breathtakingly bold idea for a young frontier officer with no army. But Clark was persuasive. He took his plan to the government of Virginia, to Governor Patrick Henry, and to men like Thomas Jefferson and George Mason, and he sold it. In early 1778, he received secret authorization, a modest sum of money, and permission to raise a small force and attempt the conquest of the Illinois country. He had his commission. Now he had to conquer an empire with almost nothing. Clark managed to raise only a small force, around 175 men, for a task that, on any rational assessment, required an army. He was proposing to seize British-held towns hundreds of miles away in the wilderness, with a force smaller than a single regiment. It should have been impossible. Clark made it work through speed, surprise, and psychology. In the summer of 1778, Clark led his little band down the Ohio River and then struck out overland toward his first target, the town of Kaskaskia, one of the old French settlements on the Mississippi, now under British control. The population of these Illinois country towns was largely French, the descendants of the original French colonists, who had come under British rule only after France's defeat in the previous war, and who had little love for their new masters. Clark understood this, and he made it his weapon. On the night of the 4th of July, 1778, he approached Kaskaskia and took it entirely by surprise, walking into the town and seizing it without firing a shot. And then, instead of behaving as a conqueror, he played a subtler game. He worked on the fears and the sympathies of the French inhabitants. He told them that France had now entered the war on the American side, which was true, and won them over to his cause, turning potential enemies into allies and supporters. Nearby Cahokia fell the same way days later, and the crucial town of Vincennes with its Fort Sackville was brought over to the American side by persuasion as well. In a matter of weeks, with fewer than 200 men and almost no bloodshed, Clark had taken control of a huge swath of the Illinois country for Virginia and the United States. It was a stunning achievement. But holding it would be another matter entirely, because the hair buyer was coming. The news that a young Virginian had walked in and seized the Illinois country reached Detroit, and Henry Hamilton moved to undo it. In the autumn of 1778, Hamilton assembled a force, British regulars, loyalists, and native allies, several hundred strong, and made his own long march south from Detroit toward Vincennes. It was a serious effort by a capable and determined enemy, and it succeeded. In December 1778, Hamilton retook Vincennes and its Fort Sackville, capturing the small American garrison Clark had left there. The key eastern anchor of Clark's conquest was back in British hands, but then Hamilton made a decision that would prove fatal. With winter closing in, he concluded that campaigning was over until spring. He could not feed and supply a large force through the cold months, so he sent most of his native allies back to their villages and dismissed many of his loyalists to their homes, intending to hold Vincennes with a reduced garrison, around 90 men, and to resume the offensive in the spring, when he would gather his full strength again and march to crush Clark's remaining posts and reclaim the entire region. It was a reasonable plan, built on a reasonable assumption that no one would be insane enough to campaign across the flooded winter wilderness. Nobody made war in that country in February. The rivers were up, the plains were drowned, the cold was punishing. Hamilton settled in to wait out the winter behind his walls, confident that Clark, far to the west at Kaskaskia, could do nothing until the weather turned. He had made exactly the wrong assumption about exactly the wrong man. Because when word reached Clark at the end of January that Hamilton had retaken Vincennes and then weakened his own garrison for the winter, Clark saw not a disaster, but an opening, and he decided to do the impossible. Clark's reasoning was as cold and clear as it was audacious. If he waited until spring, Hamilton would rebuild his army, gather his allies, and march west to destroy him with overwhelming force. Clark could not win that fight, but right now, in the dead of winter, Hamilton sat in Fort Sackville with only about 90 men, certain he was safe precisely because the season made attack impossible. So Clark would make the impossible attack. He would march his tiny army across the flooded winter wilderness, appear before Fort Sackville when no enemy could imagine it, and take Hamilton before he could ever gather his strength. He laid it out with grim honesty in a letter to Governor Patrick Henry. The case, he admitted, was desperate. If he was sure of reinforcements, he would not attempt it. But no time could be lost. If he failed to act, the whole West, Illinois, and Kentucky alike might be lost. Great things, he wrote, have been effected by a few men well conducted. He would gamble everything on a single throw. To make it work, he split his force. He sent a boat, the Willing, loaded with cannon and supplies, down the Mississippi and up the Ohio and Wabash by the long water route to meet him near Vincennes. And he himself would take the rest of his men, roughly 170, about half of them French volunteers who had joined his cause, and march them overland, straight across the drowned plains of what is now Illinois, some 200 miles in February, to fall on Fort Sackville by surprise. On the 5th of February 1779, Clark set out. Ahead of his little column lay 200 miles of the worst country imaginable, much of it underwater. What his men were about to endure on that march is the reason the campaign is remembered as one of the great feats of endurance in American military history. The march to Vincennes was an ordeal that beggars belief. The winter rains had turned the flat prairies of the Illinois country into a vast, freezing floodplain. Mile after mile of shallow water and drowned land, with no dry ground to camp on and no way around. For weeks, Clark's men waded rather than marched, slogging forward through icy water that ranged from ankle-deep to, at the worst crossings, chest-deep and neck-deep. There was no fire at night in the flooded country, no dry clothing, no comfort. The pack animals gave out and died. The provisions ran short and then ran out entirely, and the men went days without food, subsisting on whatever game they could take. By the final days, the suffering was extreme. The men were starving, exhausted, and half frozen, and morale hung by a thread. The French volunteers in particular began to despair and talk of turning back. What held the column together was Clark himself. He understood that, in a trial like this, the commander's will is everything. He drove the men forward, kept up a relentless show of confidence and good cheer, even as he privately doubted, and led from the very front, wading first into every flooded crossing so that no man could say the general asked what he would not do himself. At the last, before the worst crossing of all, a 5-mile stretch of floodplain that submerged the men to their chests in near freezing water, Clark, in a piece of theater worthy of the moment, blackened his face with gunpowder like a warrior and plunged in at the head of his men, ordering a song struck up, driving them across by sheer force of personality. They made it. On the 23rd of February, 1779, after 18 days of this, Clark's ragged, starving, waterlogged little army emerged from the wilderness within sight of Vincennes and Fort Sackville, exactly where Henry Hamilton believed no enemy on earth could possibly be. The garrison had no idea they were there. Clark had achieved the impossible. Now he had to take the fort, and he would do it not with the strength he did not have, but with terror. Clark had perhaps 170 exhausted men and no artillery yet in hand. The boat carrying his cannon had not arrived. Against him stood a fort with walls, a garrison, and guns. By any conventional measure, he lacked the force to storm it, so he attacked with psychology instead. His first move was to control the town. He sent word ahead to the French inhabitants of Vincennes, announcing that he had come to take the fort that very night, and warning them to stay indoors. Friends of liberty would be spared, enemies would not. Such was the fear his reputation and his impossible arrival inspired that the townspeople simply obeyed, and remarkably, not one of them slipped into the fort to warn the British that an army had materialized out of the flood. Some of the townsmen even quietly supplied Clark's men with dry powder. Then, as darkness fell, Clark opened his siege, and here his lack of numbers became a weapon. He marched his men with banners through the low ground near the fort in a way that concealed their true numbers and made his little force look like a large army. His frontier riflemen, crack shots, poured accurate fire through the fort's gun ports, picking off any defender who tried to work the cannon, keeping the garrison pinned and unable to reply effectively. Inside the fort, Hamilton was baffled and alarmed. When he asked what the shooting meant, his American prisoner, Captain Leonard Helm, is said to have answered coolly that it meant he and all his men were now prisoners of George Rogers Clark. The garrison, cut off, outshot, and facing an enemy of unknown but seemingly large strength that had appeared from an impossible direction, began to lose heart. Clark sensed it, and to break the garrison's will completely, to make surrender feel like the only alternative to annihilation, he now did the thing that fixed his reputation for ruthlessness forever. During the siege, chance handed Clark an opportunity, and he used it without flinching. A party of native warriors, allied to the British and returning from a raid against the American settlements, some of them, by the accounts, carrying fresh scalps and prisoners taken from the Kentucky frontier, approached Vincennes, unaware that the town was now in Clark's hands. Mistaking the Americans for friendly militia, they walked right into them. Clark's men fired, killing some and capturing several others. 2 of the captives turned out to be Frenchmen and were released. The rest, 4 by most accounts, though some sources say 5, were native warriors. What Clark did with them was calculated, and it was brutal. He had the prisoners brought to the main street directly in front of the fort's gate, in full view of Hamilton and the watching garrison. There they were forced to kneel, and there, one by one, they were tomahawked to death, the warriors, by the accounts, meeting their end stoically, singing their death songs, their bodies then scalped and thrown into the river. It was a deliberate act of terror, and Clark meant it to be. His purpose was twofold: to shatter the morale of the British garrison by showing them the fate that awaited defiance, and to send a message to Britain's native allies that siding with the hair buyer now meant death. It worked with horrifying efficiency. The garrison, watching men executed one by one beneath their walls, lost its nerve and pressed Hamilton to surrender. Here, honesty is essential. The exact number killed is uncertain, and whether Clark wielded the tomahawk himself is genuinely disputed. Hamilton, who later wrote the goriest account, claimed Clark did the killing personally, but Hamilton was by then a prisoner accused of war crimes, with every motive to blacken his captor, and Clark's own men gave more restrained versions. What is not disputed is the core. Clark ordered prisoners executed in cold blood in view of the fort as a weapon of terror. He never denied it, and he never apologized. The executions broke Fort Sackville. On the morning of the 25th of February, 1779, Henry Hamilton, the dreaded hair buyer of Detroit, surrendered his garrison to George Rogers Clark. Clark had shown the same hardness in the negotiations. When Hamilton first tried to arrange honorable terms, Clark rejected them out of hand and demanded unconditional surrender. Surrender at discretion, which meant Hamilton and his men placed themselves entirely at the mercy of a victor who had just demonstrated exactly how much mercy he had. Clark made plain that his cannon would soon arrive and that further resistance would be futile and fatal. Hamilton, his garrison demoralized and his own reputation making him fear for his life, gave in. He and his men marched out as prisoners. For the hated hair buyer, it was a spectacular fall, and the Americans savored it. Hamilton was sent east as a prisoner and, in a pointed reversal, was himself held in harsh confinement, in irons for a time, as the Americans treated the man they regarded as the sponsor of frontier massacre with a severity that scandalized the British. The tables had turned completely and the strategic prize was enormous. With the fall of Fort Sackville, George Rogers Clark had reconquered Vincennes and, with it, secured American control over the vast Illinois country, the great territory north of the Ohio and east of the Mississippi. He had done it with fewer than 200 men in the dead of winter without losing a single soldier in the taking of the Fort. It was one of the most remarkable feats of the entire Revolution, and it would echo far beyond the frontier, all the way to the peace table that ended the war. The significance of what Clark accomplished in that flooded winter is easy to underestimate because it happened so far from the famous battlefields, but its consequences were vast. By seizing and holding the Illinois country, Clark established a real, physical American presence across an enormous western territory, the region that would become the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, the whole of what was later called the Old Northwest. And when the war ended and the diplomats gathered in Paris to draw the borders of the new United States, that presence mattered. The Americans could argue, with soldiers on the ground to back the claim, that this Western Empire was theirs by conquest. Many historians credit Clark's campaign as a significant reason the peace treaty of 1783 set the young nation's boundary at the Mississippi River rather than at the Appalachian Mountains, nearly doubling the territory of the United States at its birth. Think about that. A red-haired Virginian in his 20s with a couple hundred men, no money, and no support from the main army had helped win for his country a domain larger than many European kingdoms. George Washington himself praised the achievement, all the more remarkable for having been won without regular troops or funds. Clark became deservedly a hero, the conqueror of the Old Northwest, the Washington of the West. He had reached the summit of his life at an age when most men are just beginning. He was brilliant, audacious, and, when he judged it necessary, utterly without mercy, the perfect instrument for the savage frontier war he was asked to wage. And then the story turns, as so many of these stories do, from triumph to tragedy, because the same country that Clark had enriched with an empire was about to abandon him, and the hardest, most self-reliant man of the Western War would spend the rest of his life being destroyed by peace. Here is the cruel epilogue that the heroic legend usually leaves out. To fund his campaigns, to feed his men, buy supplies, and hold the West when the government sent him nothing, George Rogers Clark had spent and borrowed heavily, often pledging his own personal credit and signing for debts on the promise that Virginia and the new nation would repay him. They did not. For decades after the war, Clark tried to get the government to honor the debts he had incurred in its service, and for decades he was refused, ignored, and passed from one authority to another. The man who had won an empire was left to be hounded by creditors for the money he had spent winning it. It broke him. Financially ruined, embittered, and feeling betrayed by the country he had served so brilliantly, Clark declined into hard drinking and obscurity. His later years were a long humiliation. He never got the great command he wanted. His planned campaign against Detroit, the prize he always dreamed of, never came off for want of men and money. He drifted, impoverished, on the western frontier he had conquered, watching settlers pour into land he had secured, while he himself sank into debt and drink. His body failed him too. In 1809, he suffered a stroke, and afterward his right leg, badly burned and then gangrenous, had to be amputated. Late and grudgingly, Virginia at last granted the old conqueror a modest pension and awarded him a ceremonial sword, a gesture that came far too late to mean much. He suffered further strokes, and in 1818 George Rogers Clark died, partially paralyzed and largely forgotten, a ruined man living on the charity of relatives. The conqueror of the Old Northwest, the man who had doubled his country's size, ended his days broke, crippled, and abandoned by the nation he had made larger. Few falls in American history are steeper. So how do we remember George Rogers Clark? Not simply as a hero, and not simply as a villain, but as something more complicated and more true, a brilliant, audacious, ruthless man forged by the savage frontier war he was asked to fight, who did extraordinary things by extraordinary means. He marched an army through drowned wilderness that should have killed them all, and lost not a man taking the fort at the end of it. He conquered a Western empire with almost nothing, and helped win his country the whole heartland of a continent. And he did it when he judged he had to, through calculated terror, executing prisoners in cold blood beneath an enemy's walls to break their will. Both things are true. The feat and the ruthlessness are the same man. And in the end, the frontier that made him also mirrored him, hard, unsentimental, and quick to discard what it had used up. The most ruthless general of the Revolution died forgotten, and the nation he enlarged took a century to remember his name. We hope you found this look at one of the Revolution's most extraordinary and troubling figures worthwhile. More videos on the American War of Independence are on the way, so make sure you're subscribed and have pressed the bell so you don't miss them. A like, a comment, and a share help the channel enormously. We'll catch you on the next one.